Well, I'm not entirely certain if I should thank the organizers for inviting me, because this is really outside of my area of expertise. And being an outsider to the field, except of course as a practitioner in a modest way because I happen to teach in a university, my observations may appear, no, I don't need it, thank you, I'm not using PowerPoint, may appear rudimentary, obvious, perhaps even cliched to an audience such as this, so I offer them with some trepidation. Let me first say what I will not be doing. I will not be rehearsing the conventional normative narrative about the civic value of education, not because it is not true or because it does not command my sympathy, because it is true and it does command my sympathy, but I think I presume it's unnecessary in an audience such as this, which is already fully persuaded of the importance of education to the practice of democratic citizenship. So, compelling as the story is from Socrates to Nussbaum via Rousseau and Dewey and so on, I will not recapitulate it here, though I suppose drawing upon elements of it is inevitable. I will also not differentiate between various levels of education, primary, secondary, and tertiary. Instead, I will simply try and fulfill the mandate that was given to me by the organizers, which is to think through the public-private distinction, and I will try and suggest that in the spirit in which I think this idea has already come up in the first session this morning, that education is a good that effectively blurs the boundaries between the private and the public. And once again, let me emphasize, I'm only presenting a sort of conceptual framework for thinking about this. I do not have enough knowledge of the vast and complex landscape of educational provision in this country, of the types of institutions, particularly the multiplicity of schools, of curricula, of pedagogy, of governance, or indeed of access, to be able to offer policy recommendations. So, it is logical, even if commonplace, to split the larger question of the public and the private in education into two sets of questions, the answer to the first often providing the answer to the second in ways that the first session problematized. The first question is, of course, is education a good that has essentially personal benefits for the individual, or does it also have public benefits for society as a whole? And second, does it follow from our answer to this that if education has essentially personal benefits, it should be provided by the market, and that only if education can be demonstrated as yielding public benefits, it should be provided by the state? These questions seem to reify an implausibly rigid distinction between the private and the public, and probably worse, their answers superimpose on it tenuous assumptions about the appropriateness or inappropriateness of states and markets as providers of education. So let me start by asking what sort of a good education is, and someone raised that question a little while ago, personal or public, and why. Some of you may remember, or maybe not, a book called The Sociological Imagination by C. Wright Mills, in which he exhorted social scientists to incorporate in their object of study not just public issues, but also what he called personal troubles. In fact, he argued there that we must relate personal troubles to the larger historical and social structures, because many personal troubles cannot be understood or solved merely as troubles, must be seen as public issues, as problems of what he called history-making. And one of the examples that Mills gave can, I think, be convincingly adapted to our own central question. He said, and I'm sort of going to paraphrase his quote more or less, he said, when in a city of 100,000 people, only one man is unemployed, that is his personal trouble, and for the relief of that personal trouble, we look to the character of the man, his skills, the opportunities available to him, and so on. But when you have a nation of 50 million people, in which 15 million are unemployed, that is a public issue. And we can't hope to find a solution to that within the range of opportunities open to any one individual, because the very structure of opportunities in that society can be said to have collapsed. So if you want to state the problem correctly, you want the range of possible solutions, this requires us to consider, and again, this is a point that came up in the question, in a question in the last session, the economic and political institutions of the society and not merely the personal situation and character of a scatter of individuals. So substitute education for employment in Mills's example, and I think we have a fair sense that the private trouble of lacking an education may plausibly be viewed as a public issue of some importance. But there's another sense in which we could think about this, following T.H. Marshall, as simultaneously a private right and a public duty. In his famous book, Citizenship and Social Class, published in 1950, Marshall described education as a service of a unique kind. And what he said here was about, of course, education in relation to citizenship, that when the state guarantees that all children shall be educated, it has the requirements and nature of citizenship definitely in mind. It is trying to stimulate the growth of citizens in the making. We may disagree with what states actually have in mind, but that's another issue. So fundamentally, Marshall wanted us to regard education not as the right of the child to go to school, but as the right of the adult citizen to have been educated. And he goes on to say we have here a personal right combined with a public duty to exercise the right. And asked again, is the public duty imposed merely for the benefit of children, simply because they can't fully appreciate their own interests or because parents are not fit enough to enlighten them? And rejected that explanation, saying that as the 19th century, in his context, had worn on, political democracy needed an educated electorate, and scientific manufacture also needed educated workers and technicians. So the duty, he said, to improve and civilize oneself is a social duty and not merely a personal one, because the social health of a society depends upon the civilization of its members. And he marked the growth of public elementary education in Britain in the 19th century as the first decisive step on the road to the re-establishment of social rights in the 20th century, social rights in a more encompassing sense. So I will come back to the issue of redistribution and welfare states at the very end. Eventually, of course, Marshall recognizes that even free and compulsory primary education will not preclude inequality, because, firstly, education is simultaneously class-making and class-abating, and I think this is a very important distinction in the Indian context. And secondly, because of the obvious link between education and occupation, which tends to modify the influence of inherited privilege, tends to modify accidents of birth, but can't do away with them altogether. It seems to me that the inequalities of class and the role of education in simultaneously, in this Marshallian sense, helping to abate class inequality and entrench it, is probably a central problem in the structuring of Indian education and its provision. But let me return for the moment to the idea that this is simultaneously a privately experienced right and a public duty to exercise that right, which is why I say education appears to blur the boundaries between the private and the public. Should we be viewing education then as making this boundary fuzzy, or should we be viewing it as something which is capable of bridging the divide between the private and the public, between the right and the duty? I'm not sure of the answer to this question, but I will try and approach it by rephrasing this distinction between the private good and the public good as an analytical distinction. This does not converge or coincide entirely between the intrinsic and the instrumental value of education. The intrinsic value of education may be conceptualized in terms of, let's say, the intellectual and emotional qualities that education is believed to foster. These would include, at a minimum, a reflexive self-awareness, the ability to use to their highest potential or some potential the human faculties of reason, of intellection, of argument, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the cultivation of imagination and noble emotions like compassion and empathy and so on. It can enable also the cultivation of finer sensibilities of a literary or artistic nature and the ability thereby to appreciate the highest intellectual, scientific, cultural, artistic accomplishments of humankind. It can above all afford an individual, other background conditions being conducive, underlined, the chance of leading the kind of life she wishes to lead and to be the kind of person she wishes to be. However, these individual-centric qualities also have social benefits. They could plausibly encourage public-spirited civic behavior. In a heterogeneous society marked by cultural and religious diversity, these qualities may lead us to a genuine appreciation and respect for the cultural practices of fellow citizens who are different, encourage us to be more tolerant and accepting of minority cultures, and to be more cosmopolitan citizens in a globalized world. These are forms of intrinsic value that clearly have wider social benefits. Let me turn to the instrumental value. Clearly, as far as improvement in life chances is concerned, we cannot scoff at the instrumental value of education. At its most crass, this would be reflected in a productive workforce and cumulatively, perhaps, in the economic well-being of a nation. Such improvement can be sought and achieved by individuals in pursuit of their personal career goals, such as to become a banker or a computer scientist or a musician. But in the case of a first-generation university goer, the realization of such an ambition, such an individual ambition, is not just a personal achievement. It can be a way of eroding inherited social and economic inequality. Similarly, when women acquire an education, this is known to have empowerment consequences that can, among other things, reduce fertility rates in societies. But education can also be instrumentally useful in a bunch of other ways. The awareness made possible by education can enable the robust participation of citizens in democracy. We talked about it already, helping people to exercise their civic rights in an informed way, and when these are denied, to effectively use legal channels to claim them. Now, all of these, one might say, are things that strengthen a democracy, and this is a desirable goal, but they can also be seen not just instrumentally. They can also be seen as beneficial for individuals who possess rights in formal and legal terms, but are often denied these rights in reality. Education can be a factor that helps citizens, whether as individuals or as members of a collectivity, to claim their legal rights. As such, education not just blurs the boundaries between the public and the private, it is a good that has both intrinsic and instrumental value, both of which are experienced both in individual terms and as social goods. For this reason, something that is adjudged as having instrumental value need not be viewed as a more appropriate object of private provision rather than public provision, whether this is in individual or social terms, that is, whether it leads to better economic opportunities for an individual or it improves the growth rate in the economy. This neither necessarily makes it a more appropriate object of private provision than of public provision. In India, we often encounter the reverse argument. The popular view of education as chiefly a form of certification for employment tends to ignore the intrinsic value of education, and this too was signaled in the previous session, ignores the intrinsic value of education even as it rhetorically embraces the idea that it is something the state ought to provide. In other words, something that is seen as instrumentally useful for private goals demands public provision. Conversely, something that is seen to have intrinsic value, let's say facilitating the cultivation of an appreciation of the diversity of human experiences and the diversity of social life, also does not suggest a stronger case for private provision because it is in the public interest to have a citizenry that is capable of living and working together in harmony. This is why to say that a good possesses both intrinsic and instrumental value does not necessarily, once again, prejudge the question of whether the market or the state is the most appropriate provider of it. I know that there are people who would agree that education has both intrinsic and instrumental value, but simply argue that the state is not the most efficient agency to provide it. In other words, it is not necessary that those who believe that the state should not be funding education are arguing that it isn't an intrinsic good. They could only be arguing that it is inefficient for the state to do so. But to my mind, and I do not know enough about this, but it doesn't seem to be enough to ask what is the most efficient or the most inexpensive way of delivering education, because education is not like water or electricity, in which the technical design, the economies, and the mechanisms of delivery are reasonable, or even remotely reasonable guarantors of provision. Even the definition of what is in this sector, I believe, called learning outcomes, are and should be contested. The question is as much one of state provision or funding or regulation of education as of what the content of such education should be. And I wonder if it is so easy to separate the question of the content of education from the question of who provides it. In today's context, for example, we can hardly underestimate the value of an education that makes it possible, and this I speak of the Indian context, an education that makes it possible for the young to distinguish between, at the very basic minimum, between myth, history, and science, to value free speech and dissent, and to adopt a questioning view of the world. So I've tried to argue that education seems to be a unique good, a private good with a public purpose, or a public good that also confers personal benefits, and one that possesses both intrinsic and instrumental value. Let me recall and requote Marshall here. The duty, once again, to improve and civilize oneself is therefore a social duty and not merely a personal one, because the social health of a society depends upon the civilization of its members. Well, you can leave the question of civilization aside. But for Marshall, education was a core element of social citizenship, and as I said before, he saw the growth of free and elementary public education in Britain in the 19th century as the first step towards the establishment of a broader canvas of social rights in the 20th. It's interesting that in India, we are wont to think of education as a right. We've campaigned for it. We won the battle. We have a right to education, which has been constitutionalized. We've seen it as a normatively justifiable entitlement. But it's interesting that the countries that actually made education a central object of social provision did not construct it as a social right, simply as an element of social policy, as an integral part of what a welfare state should do. And I'm going to spend a few minutes on welfare spending in education. Gopal, how am I doing for time? Oh no, I don't need 15 minutes, much less. Okay. Even as such, I think its value has been differently estimated in different places. To develop on this issue of how the value of education has been conceptualized in empirical and comparative terms, I would like to spend, as I said, a few minutes on the question of public spending on education and how this has been thought about in relation to other types of welfare spending in different welfare state regimes, obviously in the global north. Some of these show divergent national experiences across space. Others show that the place and the significance of education as a fit object of state spending changes over time, sometimes in the same country, and as the welfare state goes through crisis and reform. And I'm sort of rehearsing this story only because I think there is something of significance for our purposes that can be retrieved here. Historically then, the place of education in social policy has varied in the societies of the global north. And I'm going to try and work backwards from this empirical fact and try and infer from it how the value of education is conceptualized in different welfare architectures. Let's start with the Nordic social democracies, where education, along with a whole array of other forms of welfare, was constructed as an element of a progressive social policy rather than a right. Even when not cast as a right, the very philosophy underlying welfare provisioning in general and educational provisioning in particular made it an effective guarantee of democratic citizenship. And this philosophy is the philosophy that underpins redistributive welfare, the social solidarity that makes welfare a fundamental moral commitment in a society. And yet it is interesting that even when the welfare states of the OECD and of Scandinavia in particular were spending on education with excellent results, the scholarship on the welfare state did not consider it especially worthy of mention. So the literature on the welfare state actually does not always acknowledge the centrality of education. Esping Anderson's classic, The Three Worlds of Welfare Capitalism, does not give it particular attention. It's sort of mentioned here and there. So why in welfare state thinking does welfare state thinking literature, does public investment in education receive less importance than other social policies like social insurance or social security? This is because investment in education is not perceived empirically as having the sort of direct impact on inequality that these other policies do. an American scholar of the welfare state, comparative welfare state experiences back in the 70s, Walensky made the case for analyzing education separately from other aspects of the welfare state. And there are in the literature broadly two justifications for this view, that education should be analyzed differently from other types of welfare goods. The second one is, in fact, one that we've, the second one is one that engages directly with the question of inequality. The first is one that we've already gone over. I will mention it briefly. The first justification that is offered in this literature is that education is something that benefits the individual insofar as it contributes to the creation of individual human capital, and that gives individuals employment opportunities that then decide the kind of income that that individual can command in the labor market. So, the endorsement of other types of social policies like social security does not necessarily entail the idea that public investment in education is justifiable on this ground, that what ensues from this is private benefit rather than public good. And I think we've already dealt with this argument. The second argument is interesting. It says that while most social policies compensate for income inequalities after the fact, education seeks to influence inequality prospectively. Underlying this is the assumption that the only kind of inequality that welfare states should attend to is already existing inequality. The job of the welfare state is to address existing forms of inequality. So education furthers the project of social justice by enhancing equality of outcomes, by enhancing equality of opportunity, whereas other social policies enhance social justice by enhancing equality of outcomes. This argument, of course, quite obviously ignores the connection between, and has been mentioned in the question-answer session previously, the connection between family background, social status, economic class on the one hand, and educational achievement on the other. It also ignores the fact that public investment in education does in fact play a role in mitigating inequality across generations, gives the young opportunities for mobility that were denied to their forebears, so that what appears to be prospective is also simultaneously a way of redressing antecedent background inequalities of the past. The complementarity posited by Marshall between the private and the public aspects of education is buttressed by the data, more recent data that is, on the relationship between educational spending and public spending in general in OECD countries. Studies show that higher public, and I'll spare you the footnote, that higher public social spending is positively associated with higher educational spending in many countries, in particular the Scandinavian countries, who spend relatively more on education, or have spent relatively more on education than they have on other social policies, in contrast to countries like Germany, Spain, Italy, and Greece, which spend less on education compared to overall levels of social spending. So in what has been called the Nordic model in education, writers have found that high levels of public spending on education and lower levels of private spending translate into an impressively high proportion of the population with upper secondary school qualifications, along with the simultaneous and parallel commitment to vocational training, except perhaps in Denmark, which apparently follows the German model of the apprenticeship system. In the 50s then, Sweden transformed its existing elitist educational system into a universal and comprehensive one, which opened up access, including to higher education, and integrated vocational training into the general schooling system. This constructed what was called a citizenship-based model of education, offering access and similar quality of learning to all children, thereby compensating for background differences in income groups, family incomes, place of residence, and so on. In the 1990s, however, Sweden deregulated its educational system, allowing in private schools and introducing the principle of competition, leading even people like Esping Anderson to declare that the model had moved from an earlier redistributive social welfare regime, consumption-based redistributive social welfare regime, to a social investment state, a phrase that is, I believe, now more popular across Europe in the last 10, 15 years. A social investment state simply aims to enhance people's capacity to participate through public investment in human capital, in education, in training, even if this requires and entails some amount of recommodification of services that were previously decommodified. So Sweden in the 1950s decommodifies education, but when you have a recommodification of education taking place, you have moved to a social investment state. And this has been a central theme in debates over the last 2 decades, a history which is obviously linked to the neoliberal idea of minimal government, and a retreat from the idea of welfare based on redistribution. This is a central part of debates on how to reform the welfare state, including in the British solution of the third way some years ago. Within such a framework, social policy comes to be seen as itself productive, rather than as a straightforward burden on the economy and an obstacle to economic growth. What it proposes here is not so much to compensate for existing vulnerabilities, but more to invest in people's capacities so that they don't become vulnerable in the first place. The East Asian version of this came to be known, again in the welfare state literature, as productive welfare or productivist welfare, and we all know how strong the association or otherwise of that model is with democracy and democratic citizenship. The reason I'm rehearsing this is because it seems to me that in India, following the right to education and some of its unfortunate implementational failings and deficiencies, we are moving towards, it seems to me, if at all there is going to be any public provisioning, it is going to be cast in the language of productivist welfare. And we are seeing signs of it already in the kinds of emphasis on skilling and so on that we talk about, the public discourse is about. So the justification for providing welfare, whether it is in the social investment state of the global north or in the productivist welfare state of East Asia, seems to be the same. That is, once again, if you invest in people's capacities, there will be higher participation in the labor market. This will mean if you have enhanced employment, greater productivity. And so you're basically, by investing in education, public investment in education becomes a form of investing proactively in the capacities of putative participants in the labor market, and by extension, in the economic well-being of the nation as a whole. Interestingly, Marshall himself had appraised such an approach to education. He said, this belongs to the 19th century, because this was a way in which capitalist employers could be provided with more productive workers. Higher education was simply a means, he said, an instrument to increase the power of the nation to compete with its industrial rivals at the time. So the argument against productivist approaches to welfare and state spending justified only in productivist terms is something I think we, at least in India, need to be alert to going forward. The echoes of this critique that Marshall made, of course Marx made it much before Marshall perhaps, but is there even in sort of in arguments about how this is a form of investment in the child as a worker citizen of the future, not as a democratic citizen of the future. It certainly represents a shift from a certain understanding of welfare underpinned by arguments about redistribution, which are in turn underpinned by assumptions about social solidarity, that we're willing to pay taxes in order that this good is more widely available, equally available as an opportunity to everyone. But the new view of education in the framework of productivist welfare or social investment states is purely instrumental. It completely forsakes any view of education as having any intrinsic value. The attribution of only instrumental value will yield policy prescriptions that are compatible with the social investment state rather than a redistributive welfare state. It will privilege the imparting of education that is useful to the economic well-being of the nation. That is to say, we're already familiar with the interest in funding education, especially when it's private institutions, in funding courses and degrees that have a clear offtake in the labor market, whether it's law or engineering or computer science or whatever. There is a certain push in that direction, and there are parts of the country in which we have seen science education actually, taking a precedence over humanities and social science education, which tends to fall behind and is often even stigmatized. So the privileging of the imparting of education that is useful to the economic well-being of the nation, rather than the imparting of forms of education that don't have a direct economic contribution in any obvious sense, but do equip young citizens in the making with, let us say, at the minimum, democratic values of tolerance and compassion and civic behavior with an egalitarian sensibility. Also an intellectual orientation that encourages them to think for themselves, to question received wisdom, to make, as Professor Brighouse said, to make their own judgments. And an education that fosters such qualities can arguably be more effectively realized within the framework of a redistributive welfare state that is committed to the nurturing of democratic citizens. Mr. Behar said in his closing comment, that is, in a sense, the national goal, but it's a goal that we really observe more in the breach than in the compliance. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nirja, for your very, very complex but very important presentation. May I take half a minute to just summarize what she has said? 3 important points. One is that if you really introduce some normative concept as a breach concept to eliminate the gap, a very, very disenabling gap between the private and the public, education plays an important role. The way it has been visualized by T.H. Marshall, and basically T.H. Marshall. The other one is, and I agree with her, that what kind of view do you want to adopt towards the state intervention through policies into education? One is the instrumental view and the other one is the substantive view. And obviously she doesn't really go for the first but for the second, and everybody who is interested in normative goals of the nations will have to really support the substantive, not the instrumental. And within that, the third point is that she is organizing a moral hierarchy of concepts. For example, what is citizenship? Workers as citizens or democratic citizens? Wonderful. Then you have other concepts. I have written down some concepts, and there's a hierarchy there. The welfare, the productive and the non-productive welfare state. These are all important concepts that we can think through and work about. Now, I think I'm not going to really shape the framework for the discussion. You can go beyond these 3 points and raise many more points. We have about 15 minutes. So that's to say we have to close at about 12:15 because we started late. I'm just requesting the organizers. Prakash, we started late, so we'll have to have some leverage. So may I request you to really make the interventions? Yes, please. Mic there. We will take 3 questions in a group and then we can request Nirja to respond.
Oh, thank you for your paper. It was, I really got a lot out of it. I've been living in Sweden for 11 years, so I've seen all of those changes come to pass. And part of it has to do with the sort of the profit, the for-profit. I mean, it came up in the earlier discussion. That's been, there are some school districts, in the Stockholm area, for instance, where almost all schools are for-profit schools, which has had a devastating impact on teacher salaries, teachers' professionalism, all of those kinds of things, because the bottom line is they need to they need to make money for their investors. And the other debilitating sort of effect of this has been the severe curtailment of adult education. And so that has fallen totally off the track. So basically, if you haven't figured out what you're going to do by the time you're 14, 15 years of age, it's very hard to get back on the track to re-educate yourself. So it's becoming a real problem. But part of the reason why I'm sort of introducing these things has to do with making a distinction between schooling and education. And investment in schooling seems to be what we've been talking about, both in the earlier talks this morning and to some degree in what you're addressing here. And I'm wondering, from your perspective here in India, is there a way of investing in education that goes beyond, perhaps, investment in schools? And what would that entail?
Thank you. Yes, please. There's a silence there. No hand? Please answer the questions in the...
So I'm probably not, I presume this is an empirical question, right? So I'm, as I said at the very start, I'm really not the best person to be taking empirical questions because I don't work in this field. I do work on citizenship, I don't work on education per se. So, but as a sort of, as a hopefully slightly informed citizen, I would say in response to you that the question of the public and the private and the multiple types of provision that you have, quasi-public, quasi-private, public-private partnerships as well now, increasingly. This is a landscape that has come to be sort of quite a long time ago. So you've had private and public provisioning simultaneously existent in this country, including NGO provisioning and so on, existing for quite some time. It is in the higher education sector where we are beginning to see the emergence now of private universities, which is what I was referring to when I said legal education, engineering education, certain types of education which have labor market implications. So the irony is that the right to education in India comes to be constitutionalized and recognized at a time when the landscape is already so complex with so many multiple types of institutions that, in effect, one of the problems that arises is who do you have a right against? You have a right on the state, but the actual provisioning is so diffuse that there are multiple what they call duty bearers, the multiplicity of duty bearers who are mostly keen on avoiding that duty altogether. Many of them are in court. At least in Delhi, many of these private schools actually went to court, not wanting to take in children from what are officially called economically weaker sections. It's EWS category of students, poorer students, basically. So the right comes to life at a time when public, private, and multiple other types of provisioning is already around. So what it actually means to have a right with an obligation resting on someone is rather unclear. But I actually think that this probably needs, your question needs an answer from someone who has more expertise in the field of education than I do. But I take very well the point you made about not collapsing the distinction between schooling and education, absolutely.
Yes, please,
Thank you for the wonderful lecture, ma'am. Being a student, I have many doubts actually. I went to Narmada Bachao Andolan for my field work, and there I visited Jeevan Shalas, where they have different curriculum than the government and the other private schools. So my question is, how do you think about this community-led education? Because they don't get any funding from the private corporates or something. The community itself, the villagers itself, pays for that education, and which leads them to children get good education and they use that in their day-to-day life. So how do you see that, ma'am?
Thank you. First, second, and the third. You have to see the hands, sir, please. This person.
Thank you, madam. I'm glad you mentioned RTE. I have a small query regarding RTE. RTE is a good example of flawed law which proved a failure. Government enrollment fell by 10%. Private enrollment rose by 40% since RTE. We need choice, competition, accountability, outcomes. We require comprehensive, viable, effective, affordable model and education. So what would you take on this?
I'm a bit tentative about this question because I'm not sure how closely it relates to your talk, but anyway, I'll ask it. I think in order to understand the distinction between private and public schools and so on, and the goals of education in relation to this distinction, we've been the discourse is infused almost completely with the language of providing certain capacities, capabilities, individual resources, if you like. Now, but one of the contributions of social science to eliminating education is how education shapes identities and the relation between individuals and collectives. And I was wondering if that has any bearing on the private-public distinction, indeed on, on the terms on which we are reflecting on many issues in this conference. So, do we have something, if we adopt this kind of a perspective, does that throw some light on understanding what education aims to do, what it's actually doing, and how we distinguish between different kinds of schools or school systems? That's the question.
Yeah, there's one more there.
Okay, and we can accommodate one more question in this first round, and there will be second round, but short round.
I'm also sort of working through this question in my mind. If you considered any welfare provisioning as something that protects or furthers a certain idea of personhood, right? And not really just an idea of well-being. And if we were to consider education within that framework, and also maybe, sorry, I'm right here. And also maybe complicate that issue a little by saying that the obligations to protect personhood not only rest on one single individual, but also on the collective, right? How would that then respond to some of the debates that we have today on the RTE Act in terms of the kind of right that is conferred upon a child, or the kinds of duties that various actors play, including the state?
You want to take one more?
No, I think this is good. This is good. Okay.
There was a hand there. I think we can come back later. Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah. All fantastic questions. I wonder if I have answers. On the Narmada Valley and the Jeevan Shalas, this is not the only, as we know, there are many other such, I don't want to call them experiments, but there are other such initiatives which are doing wonderful work. Aruna Roy very recently wrote about her own sort of barefoot knowledge kind of thing in the Hindu a couple of weeks ago. So they have a different curriculum, and they are able to maintain their autonomy. They are able to teach children what we might, from our perspective, consider to be locally valuable indigenous knowledge, and so on, which is wonderful. But I don't know whether the parents of those children would want that kind of education for them, and what beyond. And I don't know whether those children also, when they grow up, where do they actually go, what kind of work do they do. If something like this can spark a whole movement, and let's say even just improve and enhance ecological sensitivity through the kind of intimate knowledge of biodiversity that these children may have, and there are many such other initiatives which do these things. So that could be wonderful in itself. But if it is the choice of the child and of the parent, and if it is a choice that the child, when an adult citizen, continues to stand by, I see nothing wrong with it. Yeah, but okay. Sorry about the fraud law. Well, yeah, what can I say? You've given a whole dissertation on the subject of education. I think accountability is very important, but you're right about private enrollment, which is why I disagree. In fact, there was some statistics we heard earlier in the day, which suggested that private enrollment was not rising. But I haven't seen the statistics from the ASR 2014, but ASR 2013 clearly shows that more than 50% kids have. In rural India have more than a 50% component of their education that is private. So even if they go to a public school, they have private tuition in the afternoon, or else before the age of 6, preschool, they are getting private education in some form. So even the component, and they showed this astonishingly, that report showed that this percentage was higher, if I remember right, in West Bengal and Tripura. So the point is that the private is never far away. In school education, the private and the public are often quite mixed together. even if you're going to a public school, you also may have a private component to your education. So how fraught the law is, I can't say. I can say that the intention was probably good, but the law does focus mainly on access, on providing access, enrollment, and infrastructure. The compliance seems to be in terms of infrastructural compliance, playgrounds, libraries, toilets, and things like that, which are essential. But perhaps the law, as far as I know, the right to education does not guarantee a right to any specific content of education. I think it refers to quality, but without actually saying what quality is. So that, I think, is the point of contest in our society. How do we determine quality of education? What do we mean by it? Which brings me straight away to the question that you very rightly raised on capacities, capabilities, and the shaping of identities. And I think that is for me, that's a very important part of what education can teach. Do we have do we learn to look at each other as equal citizens through an educational system, or do we not? Does that egalitarian impulse translate into a solidarity that we are willing to express through the payment of taxes for public services to be improved and better? I know that there's not only a funding constraint that prevents government-provided education from being better than it is. I know it's not only about funds. But that moral quality of solidarity and that egalitarian perspective is, to me, a core. But the difficulty of achieving that is also the biggest difficulty of our society and of our educational system, which is why I took the question for Professor Brighouse from here very seriously. I mean, our educational system is deeply, deeply class-structured. It's a class hierarchy which operates and is expressed through education. So what you learn is also going to be structured in that way. Yeah? Not just, how fast you learn, how quickly you can read a paragraph or a story, or how quickly you can do numbers. That too is structured in this way. But that part, perhaps organizations, that work on the ground with people can help to change, can help to modify. So lots and lots of non-governmental organizations which work from the most noble sort of intentions to transform those practices on the ground, that is wonderful. But that still does not take care of the basic structure, which is, if you like it or not, it is a class hierarchy that it expresses. So, what the hope or what the grounds for hope or optimism are there, I have no idea. I cannot say. And finally, the question at the back there about furthering a sense of personhood and not just well-being. Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think my answer would be the same as I just gave to the other question, that it demands some sort of sensitivity to society and to the collective, rather than to look at oneself as if the way you put it is the kind of personhood we are shaping. I think that's the kind of personhood that we ought to be shaping through any educational system. But in India, the need is the fact that Dalit children are still sitting outside in the verandas of schools rather than being admitted inside is to me a shining failure of our educational system.
I think we had to close this session. I'm sorry, I think I can look at Prakash and Ravi, they have some kind of a discomfort, they have pressure. So I'm so sorry. I think this the presentation was absolutely very, very enlightening, and we need to really establish a very, very substantive, normative relationship between the content of education and the future of democracy. Why is that educated people in this country and even in the US failing democracy? Is it not? It is the poor, so-called uneducated are actually doing good service to democracy, and this is what the ongoing concern of Nirja is. And so we need to really have a very longer chat with her, maybe on another occasion, Nirja. But thank you very much for the moment. Yeah, we must clap for her.